Ryan Walker is 31 years old. He has a bachelor's degree, a steady job, and roughly $40,000 in student debt. He splits a 2-bedroom apartment with a roommate he met on Facebook because doing it alone isn't something his paycheck allows. Most months after rent, groceries, his car payment and his loan payment, there's not much left, and definitely not enough to start saving for a house. His grandfather, Frank Walker, was 31 in 1962. Frank had a high school diploma, a job on an assembly line, and zero debt. He owned a 3-bedroom house on a quarter-acre lot. His wife didn't work outside the home. They had 2 kids, 1 car that was paid off, and a vacation to the lake every August. Same country, same age, same work ethic by every measure anyone could find. Widely different lives. This isn't a story about one lazy generation and one disciplined one. Ryan works harder by almost every metric than his grandfather ever had to. He's just running on a track that was quietly, deliberately rebuilt underneath him. 1 decade at a time without his permission and mostly without his knowledge. And this is the story of how that track changed, and it's the story of one family who lived through every mile of it. Frank Walker took a job at a steel plant outside Pittsburgh in 1958. The same week he turned 22. He didn't have a college degree, he didn't need one. Within 5 years, he had a union card, a pension plan, and enough income from that single job to put a down payment on a house for his new wife, Dorothy. Frank's story wasn't special. That's the entire point. Between 1945 and 1973, millions of American families lived almost exactly this story, line for line. Economists later named this period the Great Compression, a stretch of nearly 3 decades when wages for ordinary workers grew almost in lockstep with the wider economy. When the country got richer, Frank got richer too, almost automatically, almost as a matter of course. This wasn't an accident of good luck. It was engineered deliberately through specific choices. Strong labor unions gave workers like Frank real bargaining power. By the mid-1950s, roughly 1 in 3 private sector workers carried a union card, just like he did. Massive government investment in highways, universities, and housing lifted the floor for the entire economy at once, and a strict regulatory wall built in the aftermath of the Great Depression kept the banking sector boring and predictable, kept speculations in check, and kept Wall Street from swallowing Main Street whole. For Frank, none of this registered as policy. It just felt like normal life. Work hard, follow the rules, and the rest take care of itself. By the time he retired in 1986 with a full pension, that promise had been kept for him completely. Beginning to end, his son, Tom, was about to learn that the promise wasn't quite as permanent as it looked. Tom Walker followed his father into the same plant in 1975. Fresh out of high school, expecting, reasonably given everything he watched growing up, the same life his father had built. For a few years, it looked like he might get it, but then the numbers started to split. Pull up a chart of American worker productivity since 1973, next to a chart of median wages, and you see 2 lines that used to move together suddenly pull apart. Productivity kept climbing, wages flattened, and Tom felt that gap personally, year after year, long before he ever saw it drawn as a chart, in raises that stopped keeping pace with rent in a paycheck that bought a little less each season. 4 forces compounding together were quietly rewriting the rules underneath him. First, the death of organized labor. Union membership in the private sector collapsed from roughly a third of workers in his father's era to under 7% today. Without that collective bargaining power, workers like Tom lost almost all leverage to demand a fair share of rising profits. Second, globalization. Starting in the 1970s and accelerating through NAFTA in the 90s and China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001, American manufacturing jobs moved overseas at a staggering pace. Roughly a third of all US manufacturing jobs, about 5 million positions, gone between 2000 and 2010 alone. Tom's plant, like 1,000 of others, eventually became one of those numbers. Third, automation, the quieter cousin of globalization. Machines and software didn't just replace factory work, they hollowed out routine cognitive jobs too. Economists call it job polarization. Growth concentrated at the very top and the very bottom of the labor market, while the entire stable middle, the part Tom had been counting on, simply eroded away. Fourth, deregulation. Starting under Reagan and continuing for decades under both parties, the regulatory walls that had kept finance cautious and mainstream focused were torn down piece by piece. The 1999's repeal of Glass-Steagall erased a line that had stood since 1933. Financial markets grew enormously, but the gains stayed almost entirely inside the financial sector itself, nowhere near Tom's paycheck. Tom never lost his job outright. He held on, just barely, for 30 more years, watching his wages flatten while his bills quietly climbed. He retired in 2015 with no pension, and those had mostly disappeared by then too. and a 401k that had been gutted twice, once in 2001 and again in 2008, by financial crisis he had absolutely no role in causing. His son Ryan was 9 years old during the second of those crises. He doesn't remember the headlines, he remembers his parents stopped talking during dinner. If wages for workers like Tom stagnated while the overall economy kept growing, and it did, by enormous amounts, a question becomes unavoidable. Where did all that money actually go? The answer is almost uncomfortably simple. It went up. Since 1979, the share of national income flowing to the top 1% of earners has more than doubled. The share flowing to the bottom 50% has been cut nearly in half. And today, the top 1% of American households hold more combined wealth than the entire bottom 90% combined. CEO pay tells the same story in miniature, and it's a story Tom watched unfold from the factory floor. In 1965, the average American CEO earned about 20 times what their average worker earned. By 2021, that ratio had exploded past 350 to 1. The CEO of the company Tom worked for didn't become 18 times more. Essential to the company's success, what changed was bargaining power, stock option-driven pay structures, and a corporate culture increasingly built to reward shareholders and executives first, with workers like Tom served last, if at all.
Hello, I like money.
What inspired you to build a second Krusty Krab right next door to the original?
Money.
Corporate profits climbed to record highs over these same decades. Even as the share going to employee compensation fell, stock buybacks, illegal under SEC rules until 1982, became the dominant use of corporate profits, funneling trillions of dollars straight back to the shareholders rather than into the wages, training, or long-term security of people like Tom. None of this is conspiracy. It's documented, measurable, sitting in plain view in Federal Reserve data and corporate fillings. The American economy never stopped generating wealth after 1973. It generated more than ever before in human history. It simply stopped routing that wealth toward people like Tom Walker, and the pipe didn't run dry. It got rerouted year after year, race after missing race. By the time Ryan Walker was old enough to start his own adult life, stagnant wages would have been hard enough to deal with on their own. But Ryan wasn't just squeezed from one direction, he was squeezed from two at once, like a vice that had been slowly tightening for 50 years before he would ever earn a paycheck. While wages had stood still across his father's and grandfather's working lives, the cost of everything that actually defines a middle class life, like housing, healthcare, education, childcare, had exploded upward around him. Housing first. Median home prices have risen roughly 5 to 6 times faster than median household income since the 1970s. In many metro areas near where Ryan grew up, the price to income ratio has crossed 10 to 1, mathematically out of reach for normal income, no matter how carefully that income gets saved. Then healthcare. Employer health insurance premiums have risen year after year at multiples of wage growth, compounding relentlessly across Ryan's entire working life so far. Medical debt is now one of the single largest causes of personal bankruptcy in the country, a uniquely American problem among wealthy nations. Then education. The one investment Ryan made that was supposed to be his surest path into a stable life, the exact path his grandfather Frank never even needed, public university tuition. Adjusted for inflation has more than tripled since 1980. Total US student debt has surpassed $1.7 trillion. Ryan's $40,000 isn't an outlier, it's close to the national average for his generation. And childcare, the expense that barely existed as a line item in Frank's household because Dorothy simply stayed home. And today, full-time childcare in many American cities costs more per year than in-state university tuition. Ryan hasn't started a family yet. It's one of the main reasons why. Put it together and you get the defining contradictions of Ryan's adult life. Wages essentially flat for 50 years across 3 generations of his own family, while the actual cost of the life his grandfather took for granted climbed relentlessly upward. The math simply stopped working. Not because Ryan is worse with money than Frank was, but because the floor moved while the ceiling stayed exactly where it had always been. Here's the number that more than any other captures what happened to families like the Walkers in 1971. An estimated 61% of American adults lived in middle-income households. By 2023, that number had fallen to roughly 50%. 11 percentage point sounds modest written out like that, but it represents tens of millions of people. Tom's co-workers, Ryan's classmates, entire neighborhoods of families who over 2 generations moved out of the middle class entirely. Crucially, they didn't all move up. Some did. The upper tier grew too over this period, but the larger story is a population splitting in 2 directions at once. a shrinking middle flanked by a growing class above and a growing class below. Picture the income distribution of Frank's America as one tall, fat bell curve with most families clustered comfortably in the center. And now picture Ryan's America, pinched in the middle, bulging at both ends, an hourglass instead of a bell. The hourglass matters because the middle class was never just a statistic in a government report, it was the customer base that made mass market businesses possible. It was the tax base funding public schools, it was, for decades, the stabilizing center of Americans' democracy itself, large and secure enough to resist the pull of extremes on either side. When that center shrinks the way it has for families like the Walkers, the whole structure gets less stable, not just economically, politically too. No generation has felt this shift more actually than Ryan's, but the time millennials reached 30, they held on average roughly half the household wealth baby boomers held at the same age, adjusted for inflation. Ryan entered the workforce during the long, uneven recovery after the 2008 financial crisis, one of the worst possible moments in nearly a century to start a career. Homeownership among adults under 35 sits well below where it stood for the same age group a generation earlier. Not because Ryan and people like him don't want to own homes, surveys show they want to. Often desperately, it's because the price to income math from chapter 4 has made it mathematically out of reach in most cities, even for someone working full-time and saving responsibly, just like Ryan does. At nearly $2 trillion of collective student debt sitting specifically on younger generation's shoulder, debt his grandfather Frank never had to take on at anywhere near this scale to access the same opportunities, and you get a generation doing everything that used to guarantee stability. College, full-time work, careful budgeting, and still falling behind where their parents stood at the same age. And this is not a story about laziness. No matter how often that explanation gets repeated at family dinners, the data doesn't support it. It's a story about structural forces, wage stagnation, asset price inflation, ballooning education costs, landing their full compounding weight on the generation least equipped to absorb it. Because Ryan arrived right as the ladder his grandfather climbed was being quietly dismantled rung by rung behind him. And this decline didn't happen evenly across the country. And Ryan's own hometown is a small example of a much bigger map. The Rust Belt, Pennsylvania, through Ohio, Michigan into Wisconsin, was built almost entirely around the manufacturing economy that gave Frank his life. When that base hollowed out starting in the 1970s, it didn't just take jobs, it took tax revenue, which meant it took school funding, it took the customer's base local businesses dependent on, it took the property values families like the Walkers had treated as their retirement plan. Researchers studying these so-called left behind communities have documented measurable rises in what's sometimes called deaths of despair. Suicide, drug overdose, alcohol-related disease, concentrated specifically in regions that lost their economic base most severely. It's one of the only sustained declines in life expectancy ever recorded in a wealthy nation during peacetime. Ryan moved 2 states away for his current job, partly because the town Frank built simply didn't have an equivalent one waiting for him. Meanwhile, a small number of superstar cities like San Francisco, New York, Seattle, Boston pulled away from everywhere else, becoming magnets for high-wage tech and finance work. But that concentrated prosperity sent housing costs in those same cities into the stratosphere, creating a strange paradox. Some of the highest average incomes in the world sitting a few city blocks away from some of the worst housing affordability in the world. The geography of the middle class didn't just shrink, it fractured into prosperous islands surrounded by a much larger sea of towns, like Frank's, still waiting for a recovery that in many places never fully arrived. It's worth pausing here to ask an honest question on Ryan's behalf. Was any of this avoidable, or is this simply what happens to every advanced economy as it matures, automates, and globalizes? The forces are global. Automation and globalization touch every wealthy economy, but the outcomes are not nearly as universal as Americans often assume. Countries like Germany, Denmark, and Canada face the same technological disruptions and the same globalized competition the Walkers America faced. They built different responses around those same pressures. Stronger social safety nets, more robust labor protections, universal healthcare decoupled from employment, and in Germany's case, a vocational training system that helped smooth displaced manufacturing workers into new industries rather than simply discarding them, the way Tom's plant eventually discarded him. The result is measurable. Income inequality has risen across most wealthy nations over the past 5 decades, but dramatically faster and from a worse worse starting point in the United States than in almost any peer economy. America didn't uniquely invent the forces reshaping its middle class. It made a uniquely thorough set of choices about how to absorb those forces, and arguably a uniquely unforgiving set of choices about who will bear the cost. People like Frank, Tom, and Ryan. And this matters because it cuts against a comforting myth that what happened to families like the Walkers was simply unstoppable, like gravity, like something no country could have resisted. The international comparison says otherwise. It says, quietly but firmly, and this was a choice. Hundreds of smaller choices made across 5 decades by people who could have chosen differently. Statistics can describe the shape of what happened to the Walkers family, generation by generation, with real precision. They are much worse at describing how it actually feels to live inside it. It feels like Ryan working harder than Frank ever had to and still falling further behind year after year, no matter how carefully he budgets. It feels like Tom watching his son inherit a set of expectations, work hard, get a degree, play by the rules, that simply no longer deliver on their old promise. The exact promise that had been kept for Frank without question. It feels like the slow grinding realization somewhere in your early 30s that the rules of the game changed sometime before you even sat down at the table and nobody thought to send you the memo. This is, in the end, why the American dream still gets invoked so constantly in the American life. Even as the floor underneath it has eroded for 50 straight years, the dream survives as a story Ryan still half believes. Even on the nights the math clearly doesn't add up. Even as the actual mechanics required to make that story true for an ordinary family were quietly, systematically dismantled. One decision at a time across 3 generations of people exactly like his. That gap between the story of a country still tells itself, and the economic reality that story no longer describes may be the single most consequential and most dangerous gap in modern American life. So where does this actually leave us? Where does it leave Ryan and the tens of millions of people living some version of his exact story right now? The middle class didn't disappear because of one dramatic event. You could circle on a calendar, there was no single crash, no single villain, not one law that broke the system by itself. It eroded through 50 years of accumulated decisions about unions, about trade, about taxation, about housing, about healthcare, and about how society chooses again and again to distribute the wealth it collectively creates. And because it was built through decisions, it can in principle be unbuilt through decisions too. Nothing about Ryan's trajectory was carved into economic law before he was even born. Germany and Denmark aren't proof that decline is impossible to reverse, they're proof that it was never inevitable to begin with. But a reversal like that will require something that's been conspicuously, painfully absent from American political life for most of the last 50 years. A sustained, difficult, multi-decade national consensus that the shrinking of families like the Walkers is actually the central economic problem worth solving. More central than any quarterly earnings report. More central than any single election cycle. More central than almost anything else competing for attention. Until that conscience exists, if it ever does, the trajectory of Ryan's life and the lives of millions like him will likely keep moving in the same direction it's moved in for half a century. The hourglass will likely keep narrowing in the middle, and the story America tells you of itself and the economic reality underneath that story will likely keep drifting further apart. The American dream was never a guarantee. It was a promise made implicitly generation after generation that hard work and playing by the rules would be enough. For Frank, for about 30 years after the Second World War, that promise was kept completely. For Tom, the cracks started showing halfway through his working life, small enough at first to explain away. For Ryan, and for an enormous and growing share of his generation, the promise quietly hasn't been kept at all. Whatever it ever will be again, for Ryan or for whoever comes after him, isn't in the end a question of economics alone, it's a question of choice.